Private Thomas Jensen laughs loudest when he mocks May Collins' small tattoo. "Looks like something from a gift shop," he jeers, cameras rolling, egos high. She just nods, quiet as stone. But stick around. They thought she was just a logistics officer. What they didn't know? That TV08 marked her role in covert ops that saved hundreds and erased her from official records. Now Command's watching the footage. Jensen's not laughing anymore. And when classified becomes personal, reputations won't be the only thing burned. Justice doesn't always wear stripes. Sometimes it wears silence. Don't forget to drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time you found this video. Also, hit that subscribe button. Private Thomas Jensen stared at his polished insignia, the brass mockingly bright under the barracks' fluorescent lights. His fingers traced the edges compulsively as the morning's events replayed in his mind like a horror show. Colonel Reyes's revelation about May Collins had shattered his carefully constructed world of assumptions and prejudices. She was TV08, he muttered to himself, the words tasting bitter. Private Thomas Jensen had built his reputation on being the barracks' self-appointed gatekeeper, always ready to maintain standards through his particular brand of public humiliation. Now, those same standards were crushing him. His phone buzzed again. Another notification about the morning's incident. Someone had filmed his mockery of Collins, his sneering face immortalized as he circled her like a schoolyard bully. The video was spreading through military channels, and the comments were brutal. "Classic example of prejudice in ranks," one read. Private Thomas Jensen's hands trembled as he scrolled. A memory surfaced, unwanted and sharp. His first day at basic training, Sergeant Morris teaching them about unit cohesion. "Appearances deceive," the sergeant had warned. "The quiet ones might be your strongest assets." Private Thomas Jensen had nodded along, but he hadn't really listened. He'd been too busy categorizing, judging, deciding who deserved his respect based on his narrow worldview. Research papers scattered across his bunk caught his eye. Articles about cognitive bias in military structures, studies on how preconceptions damaged unit effectiveness. Private Thomas Jensen had ignored these mandatory readings, believing himself above such concerns. Now, each highlighted passage felt like a personal indictment. His brass insignia caught the light again. Private Thomas Jensen gripped it until his knuckles whitened. "Have you ever watched your certainties crumble?" he whispered to his reflection in the polished metal. "Have you felt the ground shift beneath your feet?" A knock at the door made him jump. "Jensen," a voice called, his squad mate Evans. "Command wants to see all documentation of your previous incidents." Private Thomas Jensen's blood ran cold. There had been others before Collins, hadn't there? How many times had he played judge and jury, never imagining his targets might be more than they appeared? His computer held records, the wall of shame photos he'd collected, the messages mocking those he deemed unworthy. The brass insignia slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering to the floor. Each bounce echoed like an accusation. Private Thomas Jensen scrambled to delete files, but his hands wouldn't stop shaking. The truth was spreading like wildfire through Fort Bragg, and he couldn't contain it. Type shame if you've ever misjudged someone and lived to regret it. His phone buzzed again. The video had reached military leadership accounts. Private Thomas Jensen watched his career prospects dissolving in real time, all because he'd never bothered to look beyond surfaces. The TV08 tattoo that had seemed so worthy of mockery now branded him instead, marked him as the fool who'd dared judge a ghost operative. Colonel Reyes's words echoed. Some of our most decorated operators prefer to remain invisible, Private Jensen. Your inability to understand this reveals more about you than them. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the barracks windows. Private Thomas Jensen sat amid his scattered attempts to cover his tracks, the weight of his actions pressing down like a physical force. His brass insignia lay forgotten on the floor, no longer a symbol of authority, but a reminder of how badly he'd abused what little power he had. I never knew, he whispered to the empty room. But I should have. Private Thomas Jensen stared at his phone, watching the view count climb on the video he now desperately wished would disappear. Each notification felt like another nail in his professional coffin, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the barracks windows. His hands trembled slightly as he scrolled through the partially redacted personnel file on his desk. The few unclassified pages about Logistics Officer May Collins told a story that made his stomach churn. TV-08, not just some random tattoo, Private Thomas Jensen muttered to himself, running his fingers over his brass insignia that now seemed to mock him from his desk. Each heavily redacted line in the file hinted at classified operations across multiple continents. The missions that weren't completely blacked out mentioned evacuations of hundreds of civilians, counter-terrorism operations that saved countless lives, all conducted under the perfect cover of a quiet logistics officer. The pinging of delete notifications echoed through the barracks as fellow soldiers frantically removed their shares of his video. Private Thomas Jensen watched his phone light up with each one, remembering how proudly he'd filmed himself just hours ago, mocking what he'd thought was just some weird tattoo. Now that same recording showed him for exactly what he was, the kind of ignorant soldier whose assumptions and big mouth could endanger covert operators like Collins. "Did you see the citation dates?" whispered Sergeant Rodriguez, passing by Private Thomas Jensen's bunk. "She was running ops while we were still in high school." The sergeant's words twisted the knife deeper, but Jensen barely registered them, too focused on the growing knot in his throat as he read through another partially unredacted mission report. His brass insignia caught the light, reminding Private Thomas Jensen of everything it was supposed to represent: honor, respect, judgment. He couldn't even look at it now. The same insignia he'd polished so proudly this morning while planning his little video ambush now sat untouched, collecting dust as the afternoon wore on. Have you ever felt your world turn upside down as everything you thought you knew crumbled? Private Thomas Jensen certainly had, watching helplessly as his phone buzzed with another notification, this time from command. His hands shook so badly he almost dropped the device. The message was brief but clear. Report to the colonel's office at 0800 tomorrow. The familiar pinging of delete notifications continued, but they offered no comfort now. Private Thomas Jensen's video might be disappearing from his fellow soldiers' phones, but he knew the damage was done. Somewhere in the building, a decorated covert operative was probably already planning her next mission, while he sat here realizing just how close his ignorance had come to compromising years of careful anonymity. Type humble if you've ever had your assumptions completely shattered. The afternoon sun continued its slow march across the barracks floor, but Private Thomas Jensen barely noticed. His world had shrunk to the space between his brass insignia and that damning personnel file, each partially unredacted line another reminder of how catastrophically wrong he'd been. The sound of delete notifications kept pinging through the air like tiny judgments, each one echoing the lesson he'd learned far too late. Private Thomas Jensen stood at parade rest in Fort Bragg's training yard, savoring the morning sun on his face and the familiar weight of authority settling across his shoulders. The small crowd of junior enlisted had already gathered. They always did when he held court. His kingdom might be small, but here, his word was law. The new logistics officer, May Collins, methodically arranged gear nearby, her movements precise and unhurried. Private Thomas Jensen's gaze fixed on that tiny purple triangle peeking from beneath her sleeve. TV-08, barely visible, but somehow defiant. A perfect target. "Gather round, boys," Private Thomas Jensen called out, his voice carrying across the yard with practiced command. "See that cute little tattoo our supplies chief is sporting? Probably got it between picking out promise rings at Claire's." His laughter boomed, encouraging ripples of chuckles from his audience. But something felt off. The way Collins continued her work, each movement deliberate, each piece of equipment placed with surgical precision, it wasn't the flustered response he'd expected. Private Thomas Jensen's fingers instinctively brushed his name tape, his personal token of authority. "What's wrong, Collins? Too fancy to share the story of your mall adventure?" The silence that followed felt heavy, practiced. Collins didn't even flinch, continuing her inventory with the same methodical focus. Private Thomas Jensen's unease grew as he noticed her hands, calloused in places that didn't match her logistics role, with subtle scars that spoke of something beyond supply runs. "Come on, show us the artwork." Private Thomas Jensen stepped closer, his voice carrying a hint of challenge. "Let everyone see what kind of professional you are." The words tasted like victory, but the slight tremor in his hand betrayed a growing uncertainty. A senior NCO appeared at the edge of the yard, his eyes widening at the sight of Collins. "Major Collins, ma'am. The General needs those special operations requisitions immediately." The world seemed to tilt beneath Private Thomas Jensen's feet as the NCO snapped to attention with a respect he'd never shown anyone in logistics. Collins finally looked up, her gaze meeting Private Thomas Jensen's with the same calculated precision she'd shown the equipment. No anger, no defense, just the weight of years he couldn't begin to understand. His kingdom suddenly felt very small indeed. Will Private Thomas Jensen's carefully constructed authority survive this collision with a reality beyond his comprehension? What lies beneath the surface of those he's so quick to judge? Type humbled, if you've ever misjudged someone who turned out to be more than they seemed. The morning sun still blazed overhead, but Private Thomas Jensen's shadow seemed smaller now, shrinking with each methodical movement of the decorated operative he'd mistaken for an easy target. Officer Thomas Jensen's boots scraped against the concrete of Fort Bragg's parade ground, each step heavier than the last. The setting sun cast long shadows across the yard as he gripped his insignia, its metal edges digging into his palm. The same insignia he'd polished obsessively this morning, believing it made him untouchable, now felt like a burning brand of shame. Hours earlier, he'd been the lord of his domain, mocking May Collins's TV-08 tattoo to raucous laughter. Now, walking towards the evening formation with trembling legs, Officer Thomas Jensen felt the weight of hundreds of eyes boring into him. His throat constricted as he spotted May standing at attention, her posture impeccable, her presence somehow larger than her slight frame suggested. "Forward, march!" The command echoed across the yard, and Officer Thomas Jensen's legs moved mechanically. The only sound was the rhythmic click of boot heels on concrete, a sound that used to fill him with pride, but now marked the cadence of his humiliation. His own footsteps faltered, breaking rhythm. "Logistics Officer Collins," he called out, his voice cracking slightly. The yard fell deadly silent. The word stuck in his throat as he extended the insignia. "I owe you a public apology." The admission tasted bitter, but the growing knot in his stomach demanded release. I judged without knowledge. I mocked without understanding. I was wrong. May Collins accepted his insignia with a single, precise nod. No triumph in her eyes, no smugness. Just quiet professionalism that made Officer Thomas Jensen's earlier behavior seem even more childish. Then she did something unexpected. "Formation, eyes front," she commanded, her voice carrying effortlessly across the yard. "Today, we learned signals that could mean the difference between life and death in the field." Her hands, the same ones Officer Thomas Jensen had dismissed as too gentle for real service, moved with lethal precision. The first combat technique she demonstrated left Officer Thomas Jensen's jaw slack. He'd never seen anything like it. Efficient, deadly, and far beyond his own training level. Each movement revealed years of expertise he'd been too blind to see beneath her logistics officer facade. Type "respect earned" if you've ever misjudged someone who later proved their worth, flashed across the screen as Officer Thomas Jensen watched May Collins transform the formation into an impromptu combat class. His insignia glinted in her pocket as she moved, catching the last rays of sunlight. The same badge he'd used to assert his superiority now served as a reminder of his humbling. Around him, soldiers who'd laughed at his jokes hours ago now watched May with rapt attention, absorbing knowledge that could save their lives. "The basics of survival aren't always what they seem," May explained, demonstrating another technique. Officer Thomas Jensen found himself stepping forward, eager to learn, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine respect. The TVZO-8 tattoo on her wrist, which he'd mocked so cruelly, now seemed to pulse with untold stories of classified missions and hard-won expertise. His world had shifted in the space of one evening formation. The hierarchy he'd believed in so firmly had crumbled, replaced by a deeper understanding of true service and capability. As the training continued, Officer Thomas Jensen felt the last vestiges of his pride dissolve into something better: humility. "Share this moment if you believe in the power of eating humble pie," appeared as the sun finally set over Fort Bragg, casting the formation in deepening shadows. Officer Thomas Jensen stood straighter, watching May Collins teach with the same dedication he'd once mocked. His insignia, now a symbol of his transformation rather than his authority, remained in her pocket. A reminder that respect is earned, not demanded, and that true strength often comes in unexpected packages. Private Thomas Jensen stared at his reflection in the polished surface of his brass insignia, the metal catching the dim light of the night watch station. His fingers traced the edges that once felt like a crown, but now weighed heavy with the burden of understanding. 24 hours ago, he had been a different man, an arrogant fool who thought rank and appearance defined worth. The security cameras' soft hum filled the quiet hallway as Private Thomas Jensen placed his insignia beside May Collins' workstation, arranging it deliberately next to where she usually sat. His throat tightened as he remembered his loud, mocking voice echoing through these same halls yesterday, pointing out her TVZO-8 tattoo like it was some kind of joke. Now that same tattoo represented everything he had failed to understand about judgment and honor. The base's atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Whispers of May Collins' actual service record had spread like wildfire, but it wasn't just about her anymore. Stories emerged from every corner of Fort Bragg. The mess hall worker who had saved an entire unit in classified operations, the maintenance technician with more covert missions than most combat teams. Private Thomas Jensen's chest tightened with each new revelation. His radio crackled, and he heard May's voice. "Station check, Jensen." Her tone carried no mockery, no revenge, just professional courtesy. That hurt more than any reprimand could have. "Clear, ma'am," Private Thomas Jensen responded, the ma'am carrying a weight it never had before. "And I understand now. About the quiet ones. About true service." Through the monitor, he watched other night shift workers moving through their duties. Each face now held a question mark, a possibility he'd never considered before. How many more May Collins were out there, serving without seeking glory, leading without needing attention? The first hints of dawn began to creep through the base windows. Private Thomas Jensen stood, straightening his uniform not out of pride now, but respect. Respect for the uniform itself and what it truly represented. The morning formation would begin soon, and he would stand among his fellow soldiers with new eyes. "You know what the hardest part is?" He spoke softly to the empty room, knowing the security cameras would record his words for May to find later. "It's not just realizing how wrong I was about you, ma'am. It's understanding how many others I've misjudged, how many lessons I've missed because I was too busy looking down instead of looking deeper." His brass insignia caught the first ray of morning sun, sending a sharp reflection across the room. Private Thomas Jensen picked it up one last time, studying its surface. This isn't just about rank anymore, he realized. It's about the weight of responsibility, the duty to see beyond the surface. The base began to stir with pre-dawn activity. Soon, he would join the formation, standing shoulder to shoulder with soldiers whose stories he might never know. But now, finally, Private Thomas Jensen understood. True strength often wore the quietest uniform, and real heroes didn't need to announce themselves. Type 1 respect if you've learned to look beyond appearances. His final night watch shift ended as it began. In silence. But this silence now felt different to Private Thomas Jensen. It was filled with the weight of wisdom, the kind that comes only through humbling yourself to learn from those you once dismissed. The morning bugle called, its notes carrying across Fort Bragg. Private Thomas Jensen squared his shoulders, ready to face the new day not as the man he was, but as the soldier he was becoming. One who had learned to see the extraordinary in the ordinary, the hero in the overlooked.